Hello, everyone. This is Seth with the World of Paleoanthropology, and today we are joined by Dr. Agustín Fuentes. He returns not because he needs an introduction, but because we love peeling back the story layer by layer. We've crossed paths in hallways and gatherings, and this time we're turning the lens inwards. His new book, Sex is a Spectrum: The Biological Limits of the Binary, pushes us to see bodies, history, and identity not in boxes, but in the vast ranges that humans naturally occupy. Let's unpack what that means, because I think it's very important. And because when we shift the lens, everything comes into focus differently. Dr. Fuentes, how are you?
I am great, Seth. Thanks for having me. Excited to chat again.
Wonderful. I'm so thrilled to have you. You are one of those professors who has such a wide range of what you study and what you're focused on, from Homo naledi to obviously sex and the spectrum and everything, which such a difference in those two topics, obviously, which is just one of the things that I think makes you just such a fascinating person to talk to. Today, we're going to focus, as I mentioned, on your new book. And I think in today's society and today's general outlook on things, it's quite important that we have this conversation because a lot of people, as I know you're aware, and as I hope many of my listeners are aware, have a deep misunderstanding of this topic. And
Yeah.
that's harmful to not just the individual that it affects, you know, trans individuals and whatnot, but people who are just trying to learn about the truth and whatnot. So, what stirred you to write this book now after previous work on race, monogamy, belief, and creativity? Like, what struck you that this is the time that we need this?
Well, it's a long answer. I'll try to make it as short as possible. There's a few chunks. I think one of the things to point out is that I have for decades now been working on sort of human evolution and human biological variation. So those two things are always the constant, right? So if you look at everything I do, those are the things that underlie everything, right? Evolutionary biology, evolutionary processes, and biological variation. I'm also really interested in human culture and the evolution of culture and human behavior and other animals' behavior. So if you mix all that stuff together, everything I do emerges from that. So that sort of makes sense. But let's think here, right, about like why did I write Sex is a Spectrum, the biological limits of the binary? And I use the subtitle there, the biological limits of the binary, because that's actually the point of the book.
Right.
And we'll come back to that. But what's funny, maybe funny is the wrong term, weird, chaotic, crazy, is that I began writing this well before where we are right now. So it dropped in May of
Right.
2025 into a world, I had handed in the final page proofs and all that before the election. Not before
Mm.
the election, before the inauguration.
Okay.
And
Right.
so it's this weird notion where you handed something in one world and it emerged in almost another.
Right.
So why write this book? Well, actually, the pattern isn't that different. The reason I wrote this book is that for years I've been, working in this area, but in the last 6 or 7 years, I've been doing a lot of work on human biocultural experience, right? What does it mean to be a human in the world? And sex and gender are those things. They're really intertwined, they're really important, and they're super biocultural, right? That is like human bodies and lives aren't like in this sort of like hard material
Mhm.
biology part and this sort of soft, mushy cultural part. It's always together. And so I've been writing about that, and you get a lot of pushback from some people, a lot of real interest from other people, and a lot of confusion from the rest of folks. And one thing I really discovered is this is an important topic. It matters to everyone. This is not just about one set of human beings. It's for everyone. Our bodies, our lives, our cultures are about all humans. And so this book I'm writing is about everyone, but most people don't recognize that. And so the level of ignorance, fear, confusion, and misunderstanding, especially right now, is so powerful that you can't go a day, right? There
Mhm.
is not a day that goes by without some really bad, ignorant, hateful statement or some fear or some confusion that most people experience around their bodies, around their sort of sense of gender identity, and around their sense of placement in the world. And like that's just not right.
Right.
Like we should be focusing on constructive, interesting stuff. So this book is to facilitate a better conversation. And the folks who've attacked it mostly haven't read it. Some people who have read it disagree with it, but do so in, I think, no, in important ways.
Mhm.
But I just wish people would have a baseline. So when we come to discuss or even fight about these topics, we at least are starting like with a basic understanding of what is biology, what is sex, and what does human variation look like? Not what do I want it to be or what do I think it should be? What is it?
Right. And I think that strikes a very important note that people, they can argue against it if they choose to, but they come from a weak point, in my
It
opinion. And
depends on what they're
obviously,
arguing, right?
well,
I mean, yeah,
the point I'm getting to is when you're arguing the biology,
yeah, yeah,
when we know
yeah,
how the biology works, we've done the science, we've done the research, we've
right,
observed it under a microscope, and we're still saying, well, no, that's not how it is. It's this way.
right, right, right. So yeah, this is I think the crux of the point, and I think a really important one. So there's two ways people respond to that. One is there's a certain subset of biologists who are like, no, sex is binary, two different things. Men
Mhm.
and women are totally different. Evolution made us that way, and that's the way it is. I'm like, dude, step back. Just check out what do we actually understand
Yeah,
about humans and about different organisms. And yes, there's really important differences between males and females, really important in many patterns. But there's also massive similarities, and a lot of questions about biology aren't necessarily best addressed by grouping things into male and female first. There's other kinds of questions. So that's one thing. The other thing, though, is people falsely invoke biology. This is, I think, what you're
hmm
getting at to make
hmm
assertions, right? So
yes,
if you
yeah,
look at some of the executive orders, no,
right,
this is the way human bodies are, not this. Like that whole point is because certain folks hate queer and trans
yes,
folks,
yeah,
right? That's it, right? Like, fine. Look, I disagree with that, but if you hate someone, just be honest and say you hate them. Don't pretend that biology supports your position.
yeah,
Be out
yeah.
there in front. If you hate someone, say, I hate these people because I don't like them. That's a horrible thing to do, but go with that and don't pretend that reality, that our bodies and our histories support what you're saying.
Absolutely, 100%. I cannot agree with that more. And in today's climate, I think, as we said, when people are out there trying to find answers and they're faced with people on high coming down with,
Yeah.
like you mentioned, executive orders, or, not dropping names per se, but childhood authors we used to love who are now diabolically, doing things. It We need facts. And when we
Yeah.
have facts, but we're not accepting them, how do you think we approach that?
Yeah.
How do we win the argument when people are faced with facts and they're just like, nope.
Well, here's the problem because a lot of people will not even understand when we say facts. What are we talking about? So, for
Mhm.
example, some of the folks that disagree with me from inside the discipline of human biology or evolutionary biology at large, they'll say, Augustine, okay, yes, there's a lot of variation in female bodies and male bodies, and yes, not all, there's a lot of variation in different how animals do male and female, but that doesn't change the fact that there's big gametes and small gametes, and
Mhm.
evolutionarily those are different. And to that I respond, well, you're partially right. Yes, gametes are different. Gametes are binary, big gamete, small gamete, right? Egg, ova, sperm. But what we're really talking about are bodies and lives. And if you're going to say that bodies and lives are binary, and remember what a binary is, let me just lay this out. A binary are two things of the same category, like a one and a zero, right?
Mhm.
They're both category number, but there's absolutely no overlap between a one and a zero, right? That's a
Mhm.
binary
Mhm.
by definition. That's how we can use it for code and what have that. It works that
Right.
way because it's either or, either or. That's a binary. That's not the way human biology or most organismal biology works. Sure, that works with it's either a big gamete or a small gamete, but are you going to tell me an ova is a female? No. There's physiological systems, there's behavior, there's content,
Mhm.
same for a sperm and a male. My point being here is that people can say, well, yes, the gametes are binary. Yes, they are. But the systems that produce them, the developmental processes, the organic structures, and the behaviors and lives of those organisms that produce gametes are not binary. They're not a one and a zero. They are the distribution of these biological materials with typical clusters. So I know that's sort of a boring, extended way to do it, but it's so important because we have to be clear on what are the facts. The facts are that binary, there is an important binary, right? Large gametes and small gametes, but that does not mean that bodies, lives, ecologies, and evolutionary histories of those who produce the different kinds of gametes are binary. And not everyone produces gas. I mean, like there's a whole bunch of other stuff going on there. And
Yeah.
so these people who are like a recent critique of me was like saying, well, Augustine sets up these straw men. He says, you know, that it doesn't explain 100% of this, or it doesn't always explain the differences between males and females. Or I'm not saying that. I'm just saying it's not binary. If it's not 100% different, it's not a binary.
Right. I mean, and that's the ironic thing is these individuals want to stick so closely to definitions, and if you want to
Yeah.
stick to definitions, well, that's the definition of binary. So
Right, right, right.
it's kind of the argument. I'm trying to remember the phrase, but all for me and none for thee, kind of
Yeah,
like it's my
yeah.
way or the highway type
My way
thing.
or the highway,
Yeah.
exactly. And it's this
Yeah.
commitment though that's it's unfortunate because variation is the heart of biology. It's the heart of
Hmm.
evolution, right? And so understanding patterns and distribution of variation should be our go-to. And you can recognize simultaneously that there's like a lot of variation in human structure and biology with some key typical patterns with incredible diversity in
Hmm.
cultural and social experience. Like all those things can go together. They don't have to fit in a nice, neat package. They're messy, but that's okay. That's biology.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, why do you think that this spectrum, this idea, feels so threatening to some? Why is this topic so threatening? As someone
Well, I
who's
mean,
been in
first,
the field.
yeah, I mean, so part of this is, and this is one of the things where we're debating with the title, right? You could just, I
Hmm.
should just say the biological limits of the binary, but that's sort of a boring title. That's what I'm talking about. I'm not saying there are no binaries. I'm saying there's a limit to understanding bodies and lives if you just focus on the binary. But sex is a spectrum is sort of where I'm going. And I think one of the reasons people have this really strong reaction is they're terrified of that term because
Hmm.
they associate it with this sort of massive representation from largely right wing nut jobs. I mean, I'm sorry, but just really hateful, crazy people who want to sort of say there's one right way to be human. This is the way. It's just not true. There are many successful ways to be human. But the point being is that these terms have become associated, right? And everyone wants to jump to, let's say, intersex or trans individuals in sports. I'm like, oh, okay, we can get to that discussion, but you shouldn't be allowed to have that discussion. Do you understand what biological variation looks like?
Hmm. Hmm.
Sports. Why are we talking about sports, right? Elite athletes are the teeniest point zero
Yes.
zero zero 0.0012% of the human population. So let's actually focus on all of us. And that's what at the beginning, I think what you said is so important. This is a story about us, right?
Hmm.
And so we need to understand us as a species and our relation and comparative sense to other related species. Then we can narrow down to these very specific topics. But I think there's an intentional use, an intentional attack on small, vulnerable minorities, populations, groups of people, and that these terms are used. And again, that was a long ramble, but the why reason people freak out has nothing to do with biology and everything to do with political culture.
Absolutely. So, as this is the common thing, if someone asks why sex is not male or female, what is the first image that you reach for to help explain this? What is the way, as a science communicator, you get this idea across to people who are open to it? Well, we'll get maybe to people who aren't so open to it a little
Right.
later, but to someone who actually just doesn't understand, how do you
Right.
explain this to people?
And that's the problem. It's a long explanation, right? So the first thing I say is that I am not saying that humans have more than two sexes, right? That there's males and females. Those are the typical trajectories or clusters. There
Hmm.
are many humans who don't fit cleanly into those categories, however you want to define them, right? So let's put that aside and let's ask, what do we mean by male? What do we mean by female? What are we actually talking about? And most people are talking about gender. Most people are talking about like, what does it mean to be a man? What does it mean to be a woman?
Hmm.
Or they say, well, you have these genitals or these gonads or these genes. I'm like, okay, those are typical distributions, but there's individuals that do not fit whatever definition you have and are going to put out there. So that's the one thing to understand. The second thing to understand is, so what if you have a definition? What is that telling you? What is your definition telling you, right? What are you interested in? Well, I'm interested in, why autism seems to be reported higher in young boys than in young girls. Clearly, this must be a genetic thing or a biological thing. Males are this way, females are this way. Then you have to ask, well, who's identifying this? What are the characteristics we're using
Hmm.
to identify this? Is there a clear biological process that we can find or associated? Actually, there's not. Are there cultural dynamics? Are little boys and little girls treated differently from the moment, from even
Hmm.
before they come
Hmm.
out of the uterus, based on assumptions and things? And so that's what I'm saying. So we really need to, rather than a simple thing, I wish I could just say, here's all the variation. That's why I wrote this book, right? The book is
Right,
short,
right.
reasonably
It
short.
is. It
So
honestly it is. Yeah.
I'm like, could you just read the book? Because the problem is, unlike like most everything, there's not a short, easy answer. Like the short, easy answer is the wrong one when it comes to humans. They're two sexes, they're totally different, right? That's an easy argument to make. What's harder is to say to people, hey, you know what? It's complicated. So I'll stop rambling in 1 second, but let me just give you one final example. I frequently, when people ask that question, what are you talking about? I'm like, okay, think of 30 people you know, 40 people you know, 20 people you know, and then think of their bodies, think of the way they present themselves and experience the world, and then divide them perfectly cleanly without any problem into two non-overlapping categories.
Yeah.
It
Not
doesn't
gonna
work.
happen.
That's not the way
Yeah.
we are, right? That's not the way
Yeah.
it works. Everyone knows there's variation. And so once you start with like, oh, there's a lot of variation, how do we ask questions about it? I would argue that a binary way, saying it's always about males versus females or males and females is different, sometimes that might help, but most of the time that doesn't help.
Absolutely. And I like how you mentioned we, depending on our gender identity or what our parents think our gender might be, even from the moment we're conceived, we're treated
Right.
differently. Having
Totally.
recently had a son, my partner and I decided that we didn't want to know sex until he
Right.
was born. We had no idea, and everyone wanted to know. My in-laws and my
Right. Right.
parents kind of forced the idea, like, "I'll figure it out or find out, let us know." They were, it's like my partner and I kept questioning, why is it so important that people know the gender and the
Right.
sex? Like, why does it matter? And I think that's interesting, like why some
Yeah.
people are so focused on that and why it matters. And we bought girls clothes, we bought boys clothes, we bought
Right.
everything, so whatever he came out as, he'd have it. And guess what, he wears some of both anyway, because
Well,
what does it
and
matter?
and yeah, and those things change over time. Like what is considered, like, remember, up until recently in many societies, all babies were the same clothes, right?
Yeah,
They don't
exactly.
like, it doesn't become gendered till later. But I think this is really important because in the context, think just specifically about your podcast here and what you talk about. The evolution of gender is fascinating. So
Mhm.
humans have evolved over time this incredibly powerful way of embodying, right, cultural ideologies, expected norms, behaviors that shapes everything about us. And that's actually fascinating. But to think there's only one way to do gender, or that
Right.
there's like, some simplistic, like, that's just not right. I mean, and in fact, I would say it's dangerous in one very specific way. I've seen more videos of people being harmed at gender reveal parties than almost anything else I've seen. So
That
it,
is a very hysterical but good point. There's actually, so living in California, I don't remember if exactly which fire it was, but it was a
uh-huh,
devastating wildfire that was
uh-huh.
caused by a gender reveal party.
See,
And it like
see,
destroyed a whole town, I think. It was like, I mean, it's funny,
yeah,
ironically, but like it's
right,
obviously not funny,
horrible,
but
yeah.
right. But like, yeah, gender reveal parties are dangerous.
But it shows you the how powerful this
Hmm.
cultural ideologies are and how it shapes our bodies, right? We know that
Exactly.
we treat, no, even if you say I'm not going to do this, you will treat your son or daughter differently, right? The way you touch them, the way you hold them, the way you interact with them without even thinking about it, because that's the cultural process and pattern. And I'm not saying that's
Yes.
bad or good. I'm saying that is. And so if we're going to talk about humans, we got to talk about bioculture, right? We got to talk about the mixture of biology. And the people who resist this in some ways want to say, no, everything comes down to biology. And that's just not true, right? I study biology, like human biology is the thing, right? Past and present. Um, but if it's only about biology, then we're missing a critical part of the human experience. And nowhere is that more important than sort of gender, sex, and that way of experiencing it.
Absolutely. Your books were some of the first that I came across when I was just getting into anthropology. And I'm forgetting the term right now, but it really struck me because being 30, the nature versus nurture argument has been very
Okay.
prevalent my whole life. Like it's just something
Yeah.
that has been politically, around. And the term that you use in, I don't recall
Race,
the
monogamy,
book.
and other lies. I use
Yes,
nature nurtural.
natural,
Nature
nurtural.
nurtural.
Yes, I love that. The idea that can you explain that real quick? What that means? I think it's a
Yeah, so
wonderful
nature
idea.
neutral. It didn't really, I thought you should never make up terms, but I did anyways. I thought it was going to stick because of this same thing, the nature nurture, like nature, everyone's all nature nurture. And it's like, and then people are like, well, it's not nature nurture. I'm like, well, but it sort of is, but it's nature nurtural. That is, it's
Right.
biocultural. That is, what happened is we have material, organic, and developmental processes that are in constant dialogue with our environment, social, ecological, nutritional, all of those kinds of things. And so they're constantly shaping each other. So to really ask a question, if you're serious scientifically about like what's up with this thing about some human or a bunch of humans, it's nature neutral. It's always going to be that. Even if it's like one gene that causes a cascade effect that's a horrible disease, like Tay-Sachs disease or something like that, even that has cultural context because the way people test for it, the way people sort of conceive their sexual or social behavior around it. There's always some aspect of nature and nurture involved in everything we do. So that's the nature nurtural thing.
Absolutely. And that has such an impact on let me rephrase that. It doesn't have such an impact. It is the impact, I would say, on forming who we are as we become
Yep.
adults. And
Yeah.
it, uh, when we talk about gender and sex and the differences, why do you think there's such a confusion about them? Well, first of all, so we elaborate and dispel some
Yeah.
confusion, can you separate the two and explain what they are?
Yeah. So I'll say in reality they're never separate, but let's do that. Let's just talk about, and it's not nature nurture. These are two categories, two analytic categories that we're using, right? Sex and gender. So in general, sex has multiple definitions depending on how you want to define it. I use what's called the 3G sex definition because I think that's what most people are referring to. And it is a typical clustering of biological parameters in the body, right? But when I say typical cluster, I'm saying this is the way many humans are, right? But there are humans who aren't. And that's, I think, really important. So the 3G sex, right? A 3G female, for example, the G's are genes, gonads, and genitals, right? So a
Okay.
3G female is XX for the 23rd chromosome, has ovaries as their gonads, and has clitoris, labia, vagina, sort of for the genital structure. A 3G male, right, is XY for the 23rd chromosome, has testes as their gonads, and has a scrotum and penis for the genitals, right? So those are two typical distributions. Now, those three Gs usually correlate with each other, but they don't always, right? So you could have not everyone fits into the 3G category, and some people don't fit into either of those categories. So once we understand that these are the typical things where most humans fit into this general category, that doesn't say this is the way this person is, right? So, for example, in 3G males, testosterone levels can vary by as much as 300% between individuals, right? In
Okay.
3G females, right, different ovarian sort of estrogen and progesterone levels can actually vary pretty substantially between individuals. Body types can vary and overlap between these things.
Mm-hmm.
And in any given human, you frequently get sort of chimeric development where you could have some testes cells in an ovary and vice versa, or you can even develop ovotestes. Anyway, that's sex though, right? So it's this typical distribution of biological characteristics. Gender, on the other hand, is a culturally defined and experienced set of expectations based on bodies. So particular bodies in a particular range then are expected to behave in certain ways, to have certain types of things that we call like masculinity or femininity, and are rewarded or punished for mapping or not mapping to those things. So gender is the roles, the expectations, the sensations. And so if you think about that there's biology with typical distributions and some variation, and gender, which is these sort of imposed cultural expectations, it is not at all surprising that there are many human beings who are like, I don't quite fit in these, right?
Mm-hmm.
My body doesn't fit the way I'm supposed to be gendered, or my gender doesn't fit the way I think my body, or there are plenty of people who are like, no, I'm fine. That's good. These seem
Mm-hmm.
to fit for me. And then when you move cross culturally, you're like, oh, wait a minute. Well, this is weird. Like
Yeah.
that's not right. What's good? And so that's where sex and gender are. But in reality, the two are always connected.
And I think that highlights such an important part about culture is that in one culture, for example, in the United States, we have, quote, two genders, male, female. But if you go back a few hundred years in what was the United States and North America, indigenous cultures had multiple genders. Other cultures today have multiple genders. And it's normal, it's not strange. It's their literal frame of mind just accepts it differently and
Right.
they process it differently. So as you said, there's multiple ways to do human right, as you said.
Right. Right.
Where
Or do
does that
human well. I don't know if
to
it's
do
doing it
human
right,
well,
but it's
not
doing
right,
it
right. To
well.
do
Yeah.
human
Yeah.
well. I don't right. There's no right way to do it. It's just doing it well. And how do you think? Well, that's a silly question. Okay, so no, it's a really silly.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, let me just from what we're talking about, I think with the gender stuff and the sex
mhm,
stuff, people tend to, so a binary I explained, it's 1, 0, right? We know what that is. People tend to think a spectrum is a line and a
right.
range on that line. That's not a spectrum, right? That's a distribution, right? On a line, right? So people think
Okay.
masculine, feminine, you fall
Hmm.
somewhere in between there. No, a spectrum, think of a light spectrum or sound spectrum. It's all the same stuff, these waves with different frequencies in different places with different typical distributions. So when we think of a spectrum of light,
Mm-hmm.
like blue, right? Blue, we're like, oh, blue and red are different. Actually, they're both light. They're just different
Right.
wavelengths in the thing. So we can identify them. They look different, but they're made of the same stuff with some different characteristics and whatever. And I think we have to be careful with gender about thinking, well, it's just always on a line, right? Because if you think of it on a line, you can't really think of that there being more than two, or really one with a sliding scale between, right? And that comes from Freud, and that comes from all the like, well, there's a sliding scale. How masculine or feminine? How gay or straight are you? I'm like, that's a
Right.
really
Right.
weird way to do human because we're all messy and there's clearly a spectrum of things, right? So, for example, what genitals you have does not correlate 100% with who you're attracted to. I mean, that right there, there's all sorts of complexities there. That right there should get you away from this, like, well, range, well, you're this way. It's like, no, you're more like over here as opposed
Yeah.
to over here.
Exactly. I think that's a wonderful illustrative thought of it's not a line, it's not a distribution, it's a spectrum of what a spectrum is. I think that's a very important way to think about this. How do you think when we are talking about gender and it is coming to policies and lawmaking, do you think that you've kind of talked about this a little bit that it's coming more from a place of fear and hate and not really a understanding of the biology. Do you think that in the current state, and I don't want to get too deeply into this, how do we change, I guess, where we're headed? How do we fix, not fix because what's
Yeah,
right, but
right.
how do we even things out so they're fair for everyone to live in this society happily
Right.
and equally, I guess is what I'm trying to ask.
How do we make things better?
Yes, how do we make things better in an easy
So
way?
let's lean into the biology to give a couple examples, right? So right now there's all the stuff about sports and gender and all that sort of stuff. So there's actually some really clear things. Number one, let's lean into the biology, and number two, let's lean into some cultural reality. So let me go with the biology first. So if you look at everyone knows that as you develop as a little human being to a big human being, right? As you grow from a child to an adult, especially like pre-puberty or what have you, uh, social and physical activity is actually really important for the development of motor coordination, of mental health, of all those kinds of things. And we also know that sports are a great way to develop social and physical and physiological correlate, refinement. So right now, why don't we shift our focus, recognizing that in fact bodies vary a lot pre-puberty in humans, and that there isn't a huge testosterone difference or muscle difference. All those things show up later. So why don't we just say, you know what? We're not going to do single gender sports. We're going to do gender open sports and let children decide which kinds of sports, which kinds of activities they want to engage engage in because there's so much variation already. Dividing them into little boys and little girls actually doesn't help. And it harms because we tend to prefer little boys doing certain sports and little girls doing others. And so we should give everyone a choice. That would actually be biologically accurate and highly beneficial for health, right? So that's one way I think that we could actually do that. Like K through six schools should have this sort of open sports thing. We should not be forcing children into
Hmm.
gender
Hmm.
specific teams before that. So that's on the one hand. Let's go on the cultural end on the same thing, sports. There's all these people, certain people arguing about women's sports and talking about trans individuals and intersex individuals. Okay, we can talk about that. But before we talk about that, if you're really concerned with women's sports, pay women athletes the same you are paying male athletes. Provide the same kind of training infrastructure. Provide the same kind of medical infrastructure. Let's get to a place where women and men have the same access, possibilities, engagement, financial rewards, medical health, and actual training. Then let's have these other discussions. But for everyone who yells women in sports, whatever,
Yeah.
I'm like, first, let me see. You need to go out there and you need to be vocal on the part of, let's say, WNBA players and make sure they are getting the respect and the financial rewards that they deserve. Or track athletes, right? Are they getting the same training? Or World Cup, what in the US we call soccer, the rest of the world calls football. I mean, the women's teams are amazing. Do they receive the same recognition, credit, and support? No. So we're not even at a very basic economic and cultural level at the
Hmm.
point where we can get into the deep nitty gritty details. We need to support women broad scale in sports. That's a cultural component. And this other, pre-puberty kids, give them sports, give them fun, let them choose what they want to do. Again, I keep rambling here, but this is really important. And this stuff is not rocket science. We
Right.
have the knowledge, we have the information.
Absolutely. And I think when you talk about these issues, it's just so interesting that when people are having these issues with gender identity and who's in what sport and who's on what team, again, it goes back to like the all for me, none for thee idea,
Yeah.
where slightly off topic, but just to frame things where it's like a certain side of the political spectrum really supposedly deeply cares about life, right?
Right,
Only before they're born, though.
right, right,
Once
right.
you come out, suddenly all of your rights and your healthcare and all that kind of goes down the drain. And it's just very interesting how that
Yeah.
works.
Well, but I mean, think about this. I mean, this is again why bioculture is so important, right? Because the way in which people perceive the world to be, and
Mhm.
the way they want the world to be or should be, has huge impacts on the way they try to force people to act or things like that. And so I think this is why education is so important. We should have the critical thinking skills to sort of recognize um, irony, lying, misinformation. Those things are really important. We need to
Yeah.
have that skill. And when it comes to bodies and lives, it's so important because so many people are suffering horribly because
Mhm.
of fear, confusion, and hate right now.
Yes.
And ignorance, right? Like why don't we teach, like, at ninth grade, no schools don't do sex ed anymore, even though they really should. But at ninth grade, we should have human biology, right? Why don't we just be like, hey, check it out. Here's what normal variation in human bodies looks like. Here's what the typical distribution is. Right now, like, so many people have eating disorders, so many people have body
Mhm.
image,
Mhm.
like all these kinds of things, because they're being lied to about what human bodies look like, what human bodies should look like, right? And thinking through that. And so there's all these crises that are based on a lack of access to information about what biology actually looks like in our species and in other species.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, since you write a lot about race and culture as well, how do you think, if we view sex through the same lens as race, what parallels and pitfalls do you see? My son is turning my chair. Sorry. What pitfalls and do you see in their parallels?
See, this is the one thing I always talk to people when we model human evolution all the time. You notice how like children are never present? I'm always thinking like the models of human evolution should always have children. Like you see someone, making an Oldowan stone tool and like the kid stealing his like blanks or
Right.
flakes or like I just think all of human existence has been so much more interesting and
Hmm.
children and then more recently dogs, like just having things around. Anyway,
Yes.
that's another story.
To touch on that real quick, just because it's been recent news, I covered in, I think, the last episode of my podcast in Portugal, where everyone at this point
Uh-huh.
I think knows I'm moving to. They discovered Neanderthal footprints on the
Yeah,
coast with
running. Yeah,
children's footprints with them. And this isn't the first time we found trace fossil
right.
footprints with children. I think there's some in the UK and in
Yeah,
obviously in Africa. But what an amazing thing to actually just get a glimpse of that moment. Like
yeah,
fossils are an amazing thing, and but trace fossils to me,
yeah.
since they're a snapshot of time of a specific moment in time, are just it's beautiful.
Yeah.
I love it. Anyway,
No, it is. And that thing with all the little Neanderthal kids running around and playing. That's what it looks
yes,
like what they were doing. So it's absolutely in the role of play. Anyway, so that's a
yeah,
whole
yeah.
other. But again, this is one of those things where we're like, no, it like there was tool making and hunting and
Mhm.
killing and fighting and having sex. Like
Yeah,
actually,
yeah,
those were like most of the time our ancestors were doing other stuff. So
exactly. Yeah, yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Wait, where were we? We were
We
just
were talking about how race and sex and how there's
right.
similarities and
Okay.
pitfalls. Yeah.
So I think something really, and here I disagree with some of my colleagues on what people call the left or whatever,
Mhm.
which are bad terms at this point. But some people are like, well,
Yeah,
race,
honestly.
sex, they're both constructed, whatever. I'm like, no, 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 no. Look, race is a social construct, right? That emerges from racism, sort of
Mhm.
a way in using superficial categories or ideologies about people to divide them up, to oppress them, to create inequalities, right? Race has nothing to do with biology. Racism can impact biology, but race is not biology. Sex, on the other hand, has a lot to do with biology, right? There's biological definitions, right? So there actually are typical pattern emergences, like I told you about the three Gs. Like
Mhm.
males and females are not fake things; they're not social constructs. They're bodies. They're distributions of organic material in particular typical patterns, right? So I think to say that race and sex are the same is wrong. However, to think about racism and sex and gender, I think you get in there because when we think about systems that are created of ideologies that differentiate people, that create hierarchies, that create systems of value and oppression, we see very much in sex and gender this deployment of incorrect, usually ideologies and perceptions, with the intent to disempower, to take away rights, to reject diversity or variation or multiple ways of being and force them into one kind of thing. So I would say the experience, right, of race and sex can be very similar, even though they're quite different things. And this is a much more complicated conversation, but I'm going to nod to it here. In the United States, for example, race and sex are always intertwined. Gender,
Mhm.
sex,
Mhm.
racism and sexuality, sexism, like, oh man, that stuff is all nested in together. So
Yeah.
really, we have to talk about them and a lot of people hate this word, but it's a very good one, in an intersectional frame. Like these things
Mhm.
all intersect bodies, lives, histories, economics, politics, all connect in some way. But I just want to be very clear. Race and sex, I don't think are the same kind of thing, right? Race is a construct that is real. It's very real. It matters whether you're black or white or Asian or Latinx in the United States. But it's not a biologically based thing, even though racism has biological impacts, whereas sex is talking about biology. We're talking
Mhm.
about biological variation in bodies.
Absolutely. So I love the way that you explain that and how we keep emphasizing that these things are categorical. And
Yeah.
so if we step back, do you think all of or most of anthropology is about revealing spectrums where we once thought were categories?
Yep. 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 Or at least revealing that these categories, yes, are part of the distributions that are spectral in nature as opposed to linear or as opposed to binary, right? I think that's why I got into anthropology because where else, what other kind of discipline allows me to draw on, my training in zoology, human biology, my work with population genetics, and my sort of ethnographic work, hanging out with people, doing participant observation in cultures and listening to their language. Like put all that stuff together. It's hard. It's difficult. It requires lots of people to collaborate together. But it is, I think you're right. It is unpacking simplistic assumptions about humans. Remember what we say, I'm going to say this next week in my first lecture in the intro anthro class. Anthropology is about making the familiar strange and the strange familiar. And I
I
think
like that.
I love that, because it's like we as humans who we should use our cognitive processes to recognize the way we experience and see the world is built up, right? It isn't some like automatic natural thing. And the way other people see and experience the world is very, very different from us. But you know what? It's very, very similar at the same time. So we're the most diverse and the most homogenous species around simultaneously, and that's cool.
Absolutely. And I think that's what attracts a lot of anthropologists to the field is that love of, wow, we're just such an interesting species. I mean,
Yeah.
obviously all animals have special things about them that are just
Right.
so amazing to learn about. I
Yeah.
mean, I don't think I've ever met an anthropologist who's not also just a general animal fan, like conservationist and just
I mean, it depends. There's plenty of anthropologists that don't
yeah,
want to do anything with
yeah.
biology or conservation who are
Okay,
like,
yeah.
I mean, there are anthropologists who call me like a racist fascist for dealing with biology. That's just stupid, right? But you're right. So many of us got into anthropology because it allowed us to sort of bring with us this sense of awe and wonder at the world,
Hmm.
right?
Yes,
Which I
that's
love,
exactly
right?
it.
And that's what I hate when scientists are like, no, I'm all objective and neutral, and I'm like, no, I do this because I love it. I'm fascinated by this stuff and confused and confounded and stimulated. This is like what I love to do. Um, so it's really weird when, like, for example, can you imagine like an intro anthropology or an intro to human evolution class being boring? I
Mm,
can't even understand, but I'm sure there
yeah.
are some, and that's a
Oh,
drag.
yeah. There has to be. There has to be. So, what do you think are what are your next steps in is there another book on the horizon? I know you said the
Yep.
term is starting, so obviously you're a busy professor. I know you do a lot of field work. I know if I don't know if you can stray a little into maybe what's going on in a certain South African cave. But
Caves.
what's next for caves? Okay, yeah, that is true. I do
So
know that.
yeah,
Yeah,
so a
what's going
couple
on with
things,
you?
right? So I'm continuing to work and I'm giving lots of lectures around this book, the SexIsASpectrum, the biological limits of the binary, because I want to get this word out. I want people to read the book. It's cheap, it's short.
Mhm.
I tried to write it in a way that's accessible. So there's tons of in the back. There's all these endnotes. If you want to go read all the hardcore science, you can do it. But if you don't want to, you just want to listen to some cool stuff. I did the audio book, right?
Mhm.
I read it,
Yes.
so I'm okay at that. I think that should be fun. So I'm going to continue with that. The next book I'm working on is called the working title. I don't know what the end of title could be. It's called Human Natures with an S.
Ooh. Okay.
And
Okay.
it's
I like
about
that.
just what we've been talking about, the many successful ways to be human. It is like,
That's
okay.
awesome.
I mean, I've spent more than a decade working with, biologists, anthropologists, philosophers, psychologists, theologians, asking about human nature. I've published a couple books on it, written all these papers, all that. And I'm like, you know what? This knowledge needs to be accessible, written in just a fun
Hmm.
format for people to read. So I'm writing a very short book, and it's just going to be about like how does this stuff work? Like what's going on?
I like that. I love
And
that
so
idea.
yeah, human natures, right? The many successful ways to be human. And so it'll be something like that. So that's the next one. I'm turning in the manuscript in January, so I'm close to a full draft already, and it's been a lot of fun, but it's very hard to write in a totally non-sciency way. It's more like, hey,
Yeah.
check this out. So I'm learning. So there's that. Have some cool projects. The whole Rising Star, as you know, it's just enormous right now.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
it's not just Rising Star. There's a whole bunch of work going on in South Africa by, well over 100 different researchers in this different area. So some cool stuff is coming out. The eLife, the big whatever is over the last 2 years. The
Hmm.
final burial paper version is it's in proofs right now, so it's just waiting to come out with all the new reviews, which are actually really worth reading. And then the paper that I'm the lead author on, the sort of context paper, that's in proofs. That should drop in the next week or two.
Oh wow.
Again,
Okay.
and I'm really hoping people will actually read the papers and not just be like, it's this, it's not, and like
Right.
just read and check it out. So those are coming. I'm not on them, but there are a number of other papers probably coming out over the next year, I think, which will be extremely interesting. And then I have an active project that we're proposing to go in for next summer to think more and more about what does it mean? What does it mean? How can we better understand what it means to live and move through those cave
Mm.
systems? What does it mean energetically? What does it mean conceptually, cognitively? What's I'm really interested in the experiential frame. Like, what does it mean to bodies and minds to do that kind of stuff? And so we're developing some really cool interdisciplinary projects around that as well. And then, there's just so much. The cradle of humankind, that area in South Africa is just, and there's many, many different research groups and folks working there. It's amazing to go there and to stand there, like stand at Rising Star or Sterkfontein or whatever, and look around, and they're all within a few kilometers. I mean, they're not
Yeah.
far from each other. It's
Yeah.
like all right there. And then that recent this publication recently out of Ethiopia, Eastern Africa, was like 2.6, whatever. Clearly genus Homo and some Australopithecus were together. Like, I think the most exciting thing is that it's pretty clear that for a good chunk of the Pleistocene and probably the Pliocene, many, many, many different sort of twists on the hominin body plan and behavioral plan coexisted and
Yes.
moved and lived across there. So this whole idea of single lineages, like the
Mhm.
Australopithecines and Homo, and man,
Out the
it is
window. Yeah.
complicated and
Yeah.
messy. But what's really interesting is we're so focused because of the nature of the fossil record. We're so focused on morphological variation and maybe tools and stuff like that. I think the new wave, and I have a article in revision. I mean, we just submitted the revision in the Journal of Archaeological Sciences, arguing what I'm about to say, that we have to move away from just analytic cognition. We have to think about emotional cognition and social relations and the social experiences and do our best. We can't reconstruct them perfectly without a time machine, but we can get closer. And I think that's the next wave for understanding human evolution. And you're going to study some of this, the sort of production and meaning
Yes.
making. And I really think
Exactly.
we need to move a little, not away from, but expand our reliance and our toolkit away from just functional responses, hunting, food getting,
Hmm.
mating,
Hmm.
avoiding predators. That's all really important. But the day-to-day life, the quotidian, the social relations, everything that we can reconstruct. The example you gave of the Neanderthal footprints, I mean, that's gold. And we will probably find more of those things if we look for them. We haven't been looking for them. And so I
Right.
think that's going to be, people have been looking for everything, but I'm just saying,
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
we haven't had an eye on that. So I'm much more interested in the boring day-to-day lives of our ancestors than the mammoth
Yes.
hunts, right? And I
Yes.
think that's going to be really interesting. And I see more and more incredible young scholars, especially from around the world, doing this kind of work. So I think that's where the future lies.
Absolutely. And I'm so glad that you brought up that is something that I'm interested in and I might be working on because that is exactly what I want. Like that whole cognition, consciousness. Why
Yep.
do we do what we
Yep.
do? And that's the thing. The bigger things are easy to figure out. Why do we hunt? Well, because we need food. Why do we have sex? Because we need to reproduce. Why do we carve? Why do we carve? Grab it. Why do we carve
Yeah.
these? That's a little
Right.
harder
Right.
to understand.
And and even more interestingly, why of all the carvings and figures, why do we see faces on animal carvings way before we see faces on human carvings?
Hmm.
Like we don't
Hmm.
see faces to about 12 or 14,000 years ago,
Right.
whereas we see 40,000 years ago, the lion figure. I mean, we see good
Right.
detailed faces earlier. That's fascinating. That's interesting. Can we for sure find out? Maybe not, but it's worth asking the question. Meaning making, I think, is an
Yes.
area of
Yes.
real, that's the next phase of
Yes.
understanding human evolution.
Absolutely. And those are like the people that I'm going to be working with who are doing meaning making. And that is just, it's so thrilling. So, do you think, I know, well, as you mentioned, and it's an obvious point, we will never know for sure what these symbols, what these signs, what these carvings meant. How can we glean information from,
Clean, yeah.
yeah, what can
So
we get from them?
Mark Kissel and I published a paper back in 2017 or 2018 called Semiosis in the Pleistocene. So semiosis is the term for meaning making, right?
Mm.
In the Cambridge Archaeology Journal, where we draw on the semiotic theoretician Charles Peirce to sort of provide a way in which we can ask these kinds of questions. So I'm not going to summarize that whole thing here, but
Mhm.
it's very important that it's not always um, what did this mean, right? Because we won't know that in many ways, but we can understand how are they made, how
Mhm.
are they distributed, where do we find them in association with. We can reconstruct the way in which things were used, deployed, and made, and that will give us a lot of insight into those kinds of questions, which I think is really important. So I think that's the first step. the first step is to move away from like, it's a symbol, like
Right.
whatever. No, what is it? How is it made? Where are the materials from? How's it distributed? Do we have any evidence of how it was used? Right? Was it repeated? So this article and Mark Kissel and Mark Kissel's a great scholar. We've collaborated on a bunch of these things, and there's a whole bunch of scholars in sort of paleoarchaeology and human evolution that are beginning to sort of put this out there over the last decade or so. Some really good folks on writing on meaning making. I've written a bunch on it, which you can take or leave. But the point is that I think this is really important, and it's going to give us a different frame for understanding cognition and social behavior, which I think is really important in our models of human evolution. Right? We've got to move away from hyper-functionalist models to think about a little bit of the messiness of
Yes,
human and hominin lives.
absolutely. And I think, isn't that the core of what anthropology is to begin with, is understanding what it
Yep,
means to be human? So,
absolutely.
and with that, is there anything that you would like to leave us with? Anything you'd like to say?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is just with the topic, and again, this book, Sex is a Spectrum, the biological limits of the binary, the reason I wrote it is that we need a better conversation. You
Hmm.
can't not talk about stuff. We have to talk about stuff. People are afraid to talk. People are angry and hateful and confused and hurt, whatever. It's true. It's really difficult. But if we don't have conversations, we lose, especially right now when so many rights and so many people are under attack. So having a conversation, doing a little bit of work so that that conversation doesn't come from a place of ignorance, I think is really important.
100% could not agree more. Everyone, this is Dr. Agustín Fuentes. Thank you so much for joining us on The Story of Us. If you learned something, enjoyed, or had fun, please like and subscribe. It was great having you all. See you next time.